Hello everyone, this is Rajesh Sengupta and we are here in the week 2 of this course. So this week we'll be talking about woven textiles and allied practices. So in this week what we will do is we'll be looking into some of the basics of weaving and then what does it mean by like warp, weft, few of the terms which are central to understanding weaving techniques, and then we'll be getting more into the details about how this kind of weaving are also interrelated with many other forms of making artifacts as well as making architecture. And then we will be looking at a number of case studies. So first, as you have already seen on screen that we have sort of flagged some of the terms here, brocade and extra weft weaving forms, and then their correlation with architecture and artifacts. So this is something that we will be kind of discussing all along in this week, and then the kind of the examples or the case studies we'll be looking at, they will look into the Baluchar sarees of Bengal, then Kanchipuram sarees of Tamil Nadu. However, it's the examples will not just be limited to these two forms of sarees, but we will have extended discussion on these two forms. And then we will also look into some of the other aspects of textile making, and then the pattern making we'll be looking at, and that will concern figuration and geometric abstraction. So figuration and geometric abstraction, they also remain central to understanding different kind of textile making traditions. Some have argued that how geometric abstraction is something that comes from much more kind of cultural understanding. However, there can be other nuanced understanding of why geometric abstraction is required and in what cases figuration can also come as something useful. So with those issues, we'll be looking into the act of weaving. Now on screen we also have an image, and this image is during the warping technique. So this is it's a simple draw loom, and in which various kinds of the simple weave can be done, but at the same time the complicated brocade weaving can also be done. Now in this case what we have here is that there is this simple the warping technique for the plain unbleached white yarn, cotton yarn. And this, in this case what happens that the first thing perhaps that also comes here, and why I wanted to show this image here is also because of that comes from my experience of how the way many of the techniques are explained and as part of a recipe book, and then how the techniques might differ when it comes to experiencing that. And then also one of the things that one needs to understand that there are many different ways in which one can understand the recipes or a particular set of instructions, but then there are certain things that we also need to understand through our bodies, and then that there also it invites sensory appreciation or understanding of certain aspects which should not be understood strictly in the technical terms. So in this warping technique what happens, or at least if I go back to my experience, then why I wanted to bring this up here, it was because that after all the things which were set on the loom, for example the heddles, and then its relationship to the paddles which we are supposed to operate with our two feet. But the thing is that happens is that the tension of the thread is something that is really important, and then the tension of the thread is not just created by the structure of the loom, but it is something that comes here with joining the threads. So is there if there are part of the fabric which are already been there. So in this case what happens in this particular way in which when the warp is there and then it needs to be connected to an already existing set of threads for that to have the tension in the loom. So there is this particular way in which these warps are twisted, one warp with another, and that is how each and every warp needs to be twisted and formed in this seamless warp. And then in this technique what happens that more than what is described in the recipes, in this one needs to understand the tension of the thread, that the threads cannot be twisted, or thread cannot be hold, these two threads cannot be hold just too strongly or too softly, but there is a particular balance in which that needs to be understood, and no recipe can actually sort of tell us that how much of balance it needs to have or how much of pressure one needs to put in sort of like joining these two warps and to make it ready for a seamless weaving. However, this is just for plain weaving, but this is just a reminder for all of us to understand that how this kind of exercises might help us to understand that some of the terms, some of the technical terms and all those things we may read, and we may try to understand weaving only through those technical lenses. However, when we are on the site, or when we are working with this particular techniques, then we find that there are more than that. Then there needs to be a bodily understanding which needs to enable that how much of what needs to be done, and being at that moment, or also like understanding all these issues through our bodies, through our senses, not just through our brain, the way it functions, or like not the way the brain remembers certain information from like understanding the techniques, is something that is very important. For that reason, why I wanted to talk about this thing at the forefront of this lecture is to make us remember that whenever we are talking about techniques, the techniques cannot just remain in the realm of understanding them through recipe, or as I have already mentioned it in the earlier lecture, that this course is not enabling us to learn to weave, or like this course is definitely not enabling us to make us understand dyeing or all the techniques as a manual, but perhaps it will lead us towards certain certain paths, and then it might give us certain leads towards going into like the hands-on practice. However, we need to also understand that this hands-on practice and the theoretical knowledge, if they are put side by side, or like if there is a synchronous relationship between these two, then that might lead to a much more holistic understanding of understanding textiles and allied practices. Now, to come to some of these technical terms and understanding that why those are there at the forefront of discussion. So the first thing first, it will come about the warp and the weft. And those are the basics of weaving. As we know that the warp is something that we have the threads which are usually like set lengthwise, and then that is also something that is stationary. It does not move. It needs to be sort of like stable throughout the weaving technique. And then it is also something that sort of runs parallel to the selvage. So if we think about like a length of a fabric, then the edges of the fabric in the two sides, that is something that is called as the selvage, and that which also holds together the entire fabric. So warp is something that sort of like runs parallelly. Then what is weft? And weft is the one which sort of like goes horizontally. So in that sense, we can consider like warp being something that is vertical and weft being something that is horizontal. Now, in a loom setup, so here we have an image of a loom, and that comes from late 19th century, and this is John Lockwood Kipling's drawing from Agra from 1870, in which we find that there is a man who's doing silk weaving on a pit loom. So what happens in terms of like any loom structure, we have something called a heddle, in which there are comb like structures in which that is there to separate the warp threads, so that like all the warp threads cannot just club together when the weaving has been done. And then there is a requirement for moving the heddles. So, or if there are more complicated ways of weaving, then there are multiple heddles instead of just one heddle. Then what happens in the heddle, there are the warp threads which are sort of passed through it. Then when weaving, the warp threads cannot just be in one level, because for inserting the weft thread, there needs to be a gap between two sets of warp threads. Only that way the weft threads can just pass through it. So the heddle's function is to separate it, and then through it there are usually paddles or other mechanisms, or in the simpler structures we find that those kind of stick or some other kind of wooden devices which are sort of inserted between these two sets of the warp threads, so that the gap is created for the weft thread to pass on. And then once the weft thread is passed on through it, and then the gap is diminished, and then another set of like warp threads are opened up. And if like the same warp threads gets opened all the time, then the web threads would not be woven into the fabric structure. It needs to have a stability, so there needs to be a locking of the web threads when the when this web threads are passed through this one set of warp threads. So this is how usually weaving is sort of like done. So in the simpler forms of weaving, we do find that there are the warping techniques are much more similar, and then they are handled the way I think in terms of like using simpler tools for moving or like raising the warp threads and sort of like making use of it for locking the web threads into it. But then like there are also complicated ways of weaving in which we find that how paddles are sort of attached to the heddle, in which like if the hands of the weaver is working towards inserting the web thread and also like finding the tension of the warp thread, and if there are other things need to be done with the hands, then the feet are used for like raising one set of warp thread and then the another set of warp thread. So like if one set of warp thread is sort of like raised by using a paddle, and then like then once the other paddle is sort of pressed, then like it is locked and another set of warp thread sort of opens up. So this is how like the weaving sort of continues. It is a very repetitive way of functioning. However, when I say repetitive, I do not try to call it as something that does not have any intellectual capabilities or like any other aspect of generation of knowledge. So with those things, what we see that in the Indian subcontinent, there have been early depictions of the use of weaving, and then like if in the text, or at least like when we see some of the archaeological evidences, so if there are woven cloth which are found in the Harappan sites, in the Indus Valley sites, we can imagine that the weaving techniques must have already been developed in the 3rd century, in the 3rd millennium BC or so on. Now, what we know that there have been pit looms which were there in the Indian subcontinent for the longest period of time, and the image that we have here, even though it comes from 19th century, from the late 19th century, it gives us a sense of how pit looms actually look like. So pit loom basically means that there is a pit inside the house. It's usually in the house of the weaver, or like in the courtyard or somewhere which is already associated with the residential spaces. So in this case, what happens, we find that in this pit loom, so the warp is sort of like stretched on the ground level, and then like the loom mechanism sort of like also functions on the ground level. However, the weaver sort of like sits, and then like their feet sort of like goes beneath the ground level. If there requires to be paddles and stuff, that definitely goes inside the pit, and that is how like the pit loom usually functions. Now with that, we find that there were early mentions of pit looms, or like there are certain indications that how pit looms had been used in the Indian subcontinent for the longest period of time. Then we also have evidences that suggest that in the northeastern region of the Indian subcontinent, there had been backstrap weaving, and backstrap weaving is something that goes very differently from this regular pit looms. In the left side of the image, we have a backstrap weaving setup, and here what we find that in this case, that this continuous warp is kind of like set into this structure, in which we have like the entire warp, the heddle, and then like the spindle, or like whatever we need to sort of like pass it through the warp for like separating it, and also like passing the web thread through it. So all those fairly simple tools, mostly made of wood or bamboo, what we find them to be like joined and made into like this one set, And the backstrap loom weaving, it sort of thrives through, like, I mean, with 2 points, in which here one can see that, I mean, there are those wooden posts where, like, I mean, one part of the loom is, like, I mean, sort of attached here, and that is how, like, I mean, the tension is created. And then the rest is where, like, I mean, there is a strap that sort of, like, I mean, goes around the weaver's body, and then the weaver needs to sit in a certain distance so that, like, I mean, the tension of the thread is remained intact. So this is how, like, I mean, the tension of the thread, that's something that I have already flagged at the beginning of this lecture, is something that remains central to all kind of weaving. If in the pit loom structure we have, like, I mean, much more sort of stable mechanism for sort of handling this tension of the warp threads, in this case is the weaver's body, which sort of, like, I mean, adjusts according to the need, and sort of, like, I mean, that is how the tension of the warp is kept intact, and then, like, I mean, the web thread is passed through it and the weaving continues. So if this is one of the things that we find, that, I mean, how there are this much more sort of both, like, I mean, this stable loom structure, at the same time the mobile loom structures, both of them, they sort of, like, I mean, stay handed, I mean, simultaneous Indian subcontinent. Then there have been also much more sort of complicated loom structures that we find, and one of the more complicated loom structure that we will see here is the draw loom structure. And so here in the right side of the slide we have a representation of a draw loom that is there from Varanasi, from Rahul Jain's workshop, that, and this photograph was taken perhaps around 2015, in which what we find that, I mean, this classic draw loom structure, in which we have, like, I mean, the weaver who is here at the right corner, and the weaver also sort of, like, I mean, you know, sits in the pit loom. And then, like, I mean, when the weaving sort of, like, I mean, continues, we find that there are, like, I mean, extra set of warp and weft threads, and for that reason, like, I mean, it's not just for the weaver to sort of, like, I mean, using the heddles and paddles to sort of, like, I mean, move the, or, like, I mean, raise the warp threads and insert the web threads, but there are many more sort of complications within this structure, and for that reason there needs to be one more person, the person that we see here, who would be sitting here on a raised platform, and their work would be to throughout, like, I mean, you know, sort of understand that which thread, or like which set of threads need to be sort of raised, and that is how, like, I mean, the web threads needs to be passed through it. So with this, what we also find that, I mean, this is a structure that says that, I mean, in this kind of weaving we are not just talking about a simple warp and a simple weft, but there are more than one set of warp and one set of weft that is involved in it. So in case of, like, I mean, the backstrap loom weaving that we have here on the left side of the screen, there is only one set of warp, even though there are two colors of the warp threads that we find here, that would be like red and black, but, like, it's just one set of warp that we have here. And usually in this case we also find that only one set of weft thread that is sort of passed through it, and this is how, like, I mean, this entire you know, this fairly simple plain weave is kind of, like, I mean, created. I mean, there, of course, there are options for sort of, like, I mean, tweaking the technique and making it much more sort of complicated and sophisticated. However, this is the basis for, like, I mean, using the backstrap loom. Whereas when we come to the pit loom structure or the draw loom structures, or, like, I mean, the standalone looms, in these cases what we have, like, I mean, at least for this Varanasi structure that we have in the right side of the screen, in this one we have that how there are two set of warp threads will be there, and then, like, I mean, of course, like, I mean, there are more than one weft threads. So more than one weft thread could also attribute to more color variations that we can have in these fabrics. However, for this warp threads, and especially for the Varanasi brocade and in velvet, what we have that, I mean, there needs to be one set of warp thread that would make the base for whatever fabric is being made, and then on the top of that, then, like, I mean, there needs to be sort of, like, I mean, you know, there needs to be, like, I mean, more than like, I mean, just um, there needs to be more sort of like, I mean, the pattern making and everything that sort of like, I mean, comes on the top layer of it. So the same goes for the weft threads as well, that how there needs to be one set of weft thread that passes through the warp, and that is how it gives the stability to the fabric. But then like if we want more patterns onto it, then there needs to have like, I mean, extra weft that would like, I mean, that would add to the patterns of the fabric. So this is how we find that it's not just a simple set of like warp and weft, but for stability, at the same time for understanding that, I mean, how the motifs would also like, I mean, flow through the entire piece of fabric. This kind of regulations are very much required. Now the other kind of weaving that we have here in terms of like, I mean, the carpet weaving, we would find in which like, I mean, instead of having like a horizontal arrangement for weaving, we also have like vertical arrangement in which like, I mean, the carpet weaving usually takes place. And also like, I mean, in terms of like the tapestry weaving, we also find that the same way that, I mean, how the vertical structure would have its prevalence. Now for tapestry weaving, we also find that, I mean, how there is no requirement for an extra warp or extra weft to be there for giving stability to the patterns, but like, I mean, the warp threads and the weft threads are sort of like, I mean, intertwined. And mostly with the weft threads, we find that with a spindle, or like, I mean, with a needle, usually like, I mean, the threads are inserted to a particular point, and then that is like sort of removed. It's not continuous weft threads, but like, I mean, the weft is like, I mean, inserted only in some places, and then the rest of it is removed. And that is how like, I mean, we have the tapestry weaving, right? These are some of the basics of how we find that the weaving structures can function, and how this various techniques, how they make sense to like, I mean, us. Now, talking about the weaving techniques, then how they manifest in the objects which come out of the loom. So in the left side of the image, we have like, I mean, some of these cotton coverings. So these coverings are fairly narrow in shape, and then they are used for like covering the upper body of women. And then like, I mean, this sort of prioritizes the weaves from Tripura in northeast. And again, we are sort of going back to the backstrap loom weaving, that if we have looked into the backstrap loom weaving, that kind of technique that sort of like continues. And this is an example of how the fabrics, they come out of this particular weaving style. So in this case, we can again like, I mean, see that, I mean, what is happening in this fabric, that, I mean, there are the set of warp are here, and then like, I mean, during setting the warp on the loom, there needs to be a measurement that, I mean, how much of this red warp will be here, and then the same red warp will be like, I mean, there on the other side of this set of patterns that sort of like, I mean, continues at the as the central band in this fabric. And then when inserting the weft threads, we find that there is also particular way in which the borders are created. So like, I mean, with there also needs to be this measurements that, I mean, what would be the gap between like, I mean, the threads and the white threads, and that is how like, I mean, the gap is maintained throughout this entire section. And then like, I mean, the rest of the fabric is kept plain. So this is how we can see that how using the different warp and weft threads, but in this fairly simple strap loom structure, how this kind of patterns can be created. Now with that, when we sort of like, I mean, come to much more complicated ones, so for example, the one we have on the right side of the screen, and this is a sari which is also made in Varanasi, but this is not a Varanasi silk brocade, but I mean, this is a woven cotton and silk mix. So in this one, what happens, we find that in the Varanasi brocades, there is something that we have, that again, that as I have mentioned, that there are the weft that sort of like, I mean, continues the warp, and the weft that like, I mean, sort of continues. And then like, I mean, there are extra set of weft which are inserted on the top of it. So by that, what happens, we find that this kind of patterns are created. Now with these patterns, what we also find here is that the patterns are definitely not continuous. So this gold wrapped thread that we have here as extra weft, which is inserted here for making this mango motif, or like all the buttas and the borders here. So all those ones are definitely not used. I mean, all those ones are like, I mean, definitely not the continuous weft thread, but like, I mean, the weft thread is inserted in only those places. So after weaving of this piece, a weaver needs to, like, I mean, sit very carefully and, like, I mean, piece out all the extra threads which would come out from the from this motifs from the back side of the sari. So this is how, like, I mean, the brocades also sort of manifest. Now another thing we can see that, I mean, why using extra weft, or when using, like, I mean, just simple weaving, then what different kind of possibilities one might open up to. So these are some of the things that we can see, that this is not just about exploring the techniques, but there are also many other ways in which they need to be interpreted. That if there are particular kind of community requirement for a particular kind of weave, then we can think that, I mean, only those kind of weaving are sort of like prioritized in particular community setup or particular regions, whereas, like, I mean, this kind of much more specialized kind of weaving techniques are something those are reserved for either royalty or like very special occasions. So these are some of the things we need to understand, that, I mean, technique again is something that is integrally connected to the cultural lives of the communities, of the makers as well as the users. We'll continue more on this topic in the next lecture. Thank you.